I'm Iain Christe, and the title of my talk is Themistocles and the Space Program, but I'm really here to talk about why. Because why is an interesting question, don't you think? I think humans are the only animal that can ask why. Other animals can ask what. My dog can certainly ask, hey, what is that you're eating? And more importantly, how do I get some of it? But she doesn't know why she wants it. She just knows that she does. Now, human beings are the only species that asks why, and I think that's important. Not because it separates us from other animals, but because we're the only animal that asks why, it means that we can plan into the future. We're the only animal that can work together, and the only animal thinks that it's worth enduring a little bit of sacrifice today in order to enjoy the fruits of our labor tomorrow. And without that, I think we wouldn't have accomplished a lot of the things we have. I don't think we'd have the pyramids or the Great Wall or the internet or the printing press or mobile phones. So today I want to talk about the collective power of why and how it has generated all of those things. And to do that, I want to tell three stories. Now, one is a story from ancient history, one is a story from more recent history, and really the third is about how those two things combine with my own personal story. So our first story comes from 493 BCE. Now, obviously, it doesn't have much to do with the space program, or at least it doesn't seem to. But it's an important story, though, because it's about how the collective power of why essentially saved Western civilization as we know it. It's a story about a Greek politician and general named Themistocles and about the city of Athens. Now, the reason that Athens has anything to do with the story is because in 493, Athens was kind of an anomaly. It was a democracy. All the male adults participated in the governance of the city, but it was still kind of just an experiment. And it certainly wasn't the leader of the Hellenic community that we think of Athens being, and it hadn't been recognized as the birthplace of a major political ideology in 493. But on that day in 493, the citizens of Athens had a choice to make, and the choice they made would end up resonating down the millennia. See, Athens owned a silver mine, and that year, the silver mine had struck a particularly rich vein and had a really good year, so there was a surplus that needed to be distributed in some way. Now, so the assembly met to decide what to do with the surplus. Now, most people probably thought it was just going to get divided up amongst the citizens according to some agreed-to formula. Everybody would put the money in their pocket and go home. That seemed like the most reasonable thing to do. And then Themistocles got up and headed to the podium. And he got up there and faced his fellow citizens, and he said, you know what? I don't think we should do that. I think we should take the money, build the biggest navy in the world. A couple hundred triremes ought to do it. Now, to understand why that's a big deal, you need to understand a few things. One is that the trireme was very much the height of high technology for the day. Athens had never built one trireme, let alone 200. Building 200 would not only take all of that silver, but silver from future years, and it would take a lot of timber, it would take a lot of flax to make linen ropes, it would take metal for the fittings. Not only that, but crewing that many triremes would take like 17,000 sailors, and there were only 30,000 citizens in Athens at the time. So really, Themistocles was asking everybody to commit not just a little, their 10 drachmas or whatever they were going to put in their pocket. He was asking them to commit themselves and probably their offspring to a major civic project that was going to last years, which seems like a big ask, right? So maybe the only thing more surprising than the proposal was the fact that they said yes. And because they said yes, the citizens of Athens that day ensured that Greek civilization would survive an invasion by the Persian Empire a dozen years later. And the citizens of Athens did not know that Athens would emerge from that conflict as a leader of the Hellenic world, and that Athens would become a seat of philosophy and culture, and that Athenians would export their democratic experiment to the point where it would literally become known as the birthplace of modern civilization. So what did Themistocles say to get people to agree? Well, we don't know. But I wouldn't be surprised if he sounded a lot like another politician a couple of thousand years later when he challenged his fellow citizens to join him and join his vision for a massive civic project that would take them to a new frontier and secure their place in the future. And the politician I'm talking about is President John F. Kennedy. So this is where the story of Themistocles merges with the story of the space program, and ultimately my story, because in September of 1962, President Kennedy took the stage at Rice University, and he made his famous "We choose to go to the moon" speech, in which he said, quote, "We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade, not because it is easy, but because it is hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills, and because the challenge is one that we are willing to accept and unwilling to postpone," unquote. And in this moment, I think he appealed to the same instincts that Themistocles must have appealed to 2,500 years earlier. And that's what I call the collective power of why. Like, as human beings, we do have a natural desire to do big things, but we have an even more basic instinct to do them together because we're a tribal species. So when their fellow citizens effectively said to JFK and Themistocles, like, "Why should we go with you?" They looked at them and they said, because I need you. Because we all need each other. We can only do this if we go together. And so they went. And because they went, human beings walked on the moon and came home safely, just as JFK predicted they would. In effect, they went because they could ask why. When confronted with the choice that might have been unpalatable to each of them as individuals right then and there, they could see that if they made that sacrifice, they could combine their efforts with others who were also willing to sacrifice, and that what they could accomplish would be more than the sum of their individual efforts. The ability to ask why, to feel the power of the big idea, the power of the need to belong, to collaborate. It's been to be part of something bigger than yourself. I think that has been there since we've been able to ask why. I think it's been a pretty convincing argument every time. And yes, with that collective effort, the engineers and technicians and astronauts of NASA went together to the moon. But more to the point, that collective effort ushered in the space age. Because of that effort, human beings, all human beings, realized that we did not need to restrict ourselves to living on this planet. With the example of the Apollo program to guide us, we realized that space is part of our environment, that even space near to or far from Earth is a place that we can go to and work from. So that, at last, brings us to our last story, my story. See, I've spent my professional career, almost 40 years, following in the footsteps of those Apollo pioneers. And although I've never physically left the planet, I have in a very real way been to space. But it was only because of the continuing collective power of the big idea of why that I was able to do that. So maybe the best place to start my story is when I arrived at the Johnson Space Center to start a new job. I was there as an employee of a small Canadian company called Neptech Design Group. Basically, my job was to convince NASA that they could use our technology, something called the Space Vision System, that they could use it to help them build the space station. So I found myself handing in my graduate thesis to the registrar and getting in the car with my wife, our 2 cats, and our worldly belongings, and heading to Houston, Texas. And When I arrived at the Johnson Space Center, I found out what it was to be captured by the collective power of why, of the big idea. If there was ever an organization that operated on that basis, it was NASA and JSC. I mean, I had an office at the Johnson Space Center at JSC, on site, in the middle of the robotics section of the Mission Operation Directorate of the Space Shuttle program. To work there was to work in the middle of a bunch of people who knew that their job was flying spacecraft for a living. They ate it, they breathed it, they talked about it, they lived it every single day. To work in that environment was suddenly to be captured by the concept that humans can, and did, leave the planet on a regular basis. They didn't do it by accident. They got there and they got home again safely because of the work that was done in that building, by everyone in that building. There were no unimportant roles or functions. The success of all depended on the effort of everyone. Well, that fact is kind of obvious to me now, but it wasn't so obvious to me at the time. The realization kind of dawned slowly. I mean, at first, I just treated the job kind of like I had treated grad school. I worked on my tasks, I checked in with others, I got feedback, I worked on new challenges, and I enjoyed kind of meeting them, doing new things. But slowly it began to dawn on me that others were not only trusting me to get my bit right, they were depending on my work to make sure that their pieces of the project were successful as well. Within a few weeks, I realized these people really expected to build a space station in orbit, and they really expected that the work I was doing was going to help make that possible. Well, that's a realization that brings you up short. It's a realization that keeps you at your desk late into the evening, but not only that, it gets you out of bed at 4:30 in the morning every Thursday so you can talk to the Russian Space Agency 10 time zones away. Or it motivates you to work in the simulator, fixing crew squawks late into the night after a late training session so that things work when the crew shows up first thing in the morning, being well rested, even if you're not. It motivates you to travel to Cape Canaveral to check your system once it's installed in the space shuttle, even though you've had an attack of Bell's palsy that paralyzed half your face. See, I did all of those things, and a lot more that I've forgotten about. But I never once hesitated to have contributed less than my utmost while everybody else was contributing theirs in the service of that big idea was just unthinkable. So for more than a decade, I worked on making the space vision system work, on making my contribution to building the International Space Station, which I am proud to say I did. Maybe the moment that captures that, what it felt like best, happened much later, when the space station was flying, but it wasn't fully assembled yet. By that time, I had taken over as the CEO of the company, and I found myself standing in the muggy pre-dawn light of a Florida morning with a few thousand other people, including a busload of NEPTEC employees and special invited guests. And we were all staring at a countdown clock that was stubbornly stuck at T minus 9 minutes in the foreground of our vision. In the background, 3 kilometers away, sat the space shuttle Discovery on KSC pad 39A, a little bubble of bright light on the dark horizon. Now, the countdown was stopped because it had to wait to restart at just the right moment, because the shuttle had to launch at exactly the right time so that it could get to the space station, which is where it was headed. So after a little bit longer, they broadcast the audio of the flight director's loop, and we heard him poll the room to see if everybody was ready to restart the clock. And we heard a bunch of flight controllers saying, "Go, flight." When they were done, flight director told Capcom to tell the crew that we were go to restart the clock. And the clock started. Well, there's an immediate buzz of activity, people finding their seats, settling in. Eventually, everybody got settled. a couple of minutes to go, and then the space station appeared. It appeared because while it was still dark on the ground, the sun was already up at the altitude of the space station, so the sun reflecting off the space station could be seen on the ground. So as we were watching the space shuttle, the station came up as a bright light over the western horizon. It went over our heads, across in front of the face of the moon. It went down over the shuttle, down over the horizon. And as it did, the countdown clock got to 10 seconds, which is when the launch sequence started. And the shuttle main engines fired up, the shuttle rocked backwards, and when it came back to vertical, the solid boosters lit, and the shuttle left the pad. At first, from our distance, all we saw was a plume of smoke and steam that comes out of the blast channels. And then we saw the shuttle lifting ever so slowly. But at first, it was all in silence, because it takes about 15 seconds for the sound to travel that far. And when it arrives, it's more felt than heard. And then the shuttle gained speed. And it was rising on a dense pillar of white smoke. And then the sun came up. And that pillar of smoke was lit from above by the bright fire, man-made fire of the shuttle's engines, and below from the light of the sun. And it was magic. I turned to the person next to me, who happened to be my accountant. I said, "You know, Jeff, that is why I do this job." And you know, that was why. Because to stand there, watching that spectacle, and to be doing it with literally thousands of other people, all of whose efforts contributed to making it possible, I realized that's why humans can accomplish things like leaving the planet or anything else we really put our minds to. Because, why do we go? Why do we do it? We go because when we ask somebody, "Hey, why should I come along?" they look at us and they say, "Because we need you to come along. We can only get there if we go together." And that's why we go.